Hello, everyone. Today, in my role as one of the three RHM journal assistant editors, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Lisa DeTora. Lisa is an assistant professor of writing studies and rhetoric and director of STEM writing at Hofstra University, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in narrative medicine, disability studies and literature and culture, scientific writing, and communicating science to the public. She holds an MA and PhD in English and a graduate certificate in women's studies from the University of Rochester, as well as an MS in bioethics from Albany Medical College. Her publications include work in the humanities and medicine, statistics, and the sciences. She's a long-term professional in the fields of medical writing and publication planning, and she's been a faculty speaker on publication ethics, authorship, and the relationship of medical publications to regulatory requirements at various professional society meetings. In our first upcoming inaugural issue of RHM Journal, Lisa contributed a research article titled "The Dangers of Magical Thinking, Situating Right to Try Laws, Patients' Rights, and the Language of Advocacy." So now I'm going to ask Lisa a few questions about her work on this article, as well as some of the future directions and takeaways from her research. So I have Lisa with me, and Lisa, your piece argues that while right to try laws claim to benefit patients by expanding their access to potentially life-giving medications, the discourse, unlike a historically significant earlier critique of FDA practice called ACT UP's FDA Action Handbook, creates the appearance of personal agency by leveraging public opinion through propaganda. By replacing medical information with semantically faulty construction of rights, right to try discourse rejects the reality of physical bodies as well as conceptual bodies of medical knowledge and eliminates the possibility for meaningful rhetorical articulation. So first of all, for our readers, I was wondering if you could give a little bit of background on right to try laws, because they are relatively new to the United States. Just a little background and further context.
Great. So thank you, first of all, Erin, for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to be able to take part in this interview. So right to try laws, the first one was passed in Colorado in 2014, and these are laws that discuss a kind of autonomous right to try experimental medicines. So things that are still under investigation with pharmaceutical companies or biotechnology firms. And what most of these laws say is that as soon as you get a product through one phase 1 study, people should just be able to use that, particularly for life-threatening or sort of immediately life-threatening conditions for which there's no other therapy. And the first one of these laws, as I said, came out in Colorado, and it was sponsored by a Democrat, but the key driver behind this is a libertarian group. So it's quite interesting politically as well as sort of medically. And for me, the key danger of right to try law is that it's creating this weird false equivalency. So the discourse around right to try tells us that the medicines in the FDA pipeline are safe for right to try purposes. Mm-hmm. However, it also tries to cut FDA out of the process of evaluating the medicine or deciding whether or not it's safe for the specific use by the specific person. Mm-hmm. So it kind of puts FDA in a double bind, and it could potentially be quite dangerous. Mm-hmm. I was discussing this with some folks who I know who work in the pharmaceutical industry, and one of them pointed out to me that things that are on what's called clinical hold, so things that have been deemed too dangerous by the FDA to continue testing, mm-hmm. could still be eligible, given the way that right to try laws are written, for right to try. So this could even include things that are scientifically or medically too dangerous to use in clinical trials.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it's a little bit misleading, and I think it's well meant on the part of politicians, but it's also kind of problematic because if you sort of throw out all that medical information or the scientific information and concentrate on this discourse of constitutional rights, mm-hmm. you lose sight of the material and physical realities of illness, and you're not necessarily thinking about what's good for that patient. you're appealing to a melodramatic social narrative.
Okay.
So that was what propelled this particular paper.
Okay. Great, thank you. And then you, in your article, discuss the ACT UP FDA Action Handbook, and you write that while ACT UP kept the bodies of the sick and of medical knowledge in the forefront of its mission, Right to Try masked the effects of its practices. So can you talk a little more about the differences and what ACT UP's role was in keeping the bodies of the sick and medical knowledge in the forefront versus Right to Try?
Right. So, yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for that. So the FDA Action Handbook was produced by ACT UP, I want to say 1988 or 1989. And the situation at that time was so extremely dire for people who had HIV and AIDS because there was no treatment. This was before antiretroviral drugs were available. So the only things available that could possibly help people were experimental medicine. And at the time, FDA had various kinds of what they called expanded use options, but they were kind of complicated and kind of cumbersome. So very difficult to navigate for patients, very difficult to navigate for practicing physicians, and also created some obstacles for pharmaceutical companies. So what ACT UP did, and ACT UP was a broad-based advocacy and kind of activist group of folks, and it included many, many people who were professors and artists, and so just a very wide variety of people. So they said, okay, let's educate ourselves. So let's figure out what's going on with the FDA. Let's figure out what the FDA's job is. Let's think about bioethics. So what should the FDA be doing bioethically by its own terms? So they went back to the Belmont report, which was produced in the late 1970s, and I said, okay, the Belmont report tells us that we should be not harming anyone. We should be treating patients as autonomous and allowing them to make treatment decisions within certain parameters of safety, and we should be operating with the principle of social justice. So when they walked through these options, they're like, well, FDA is kind of falling down on its remit here. So what we want the FDA is to pick itself up and kind of do its job. So assess what's appropriate for these patients, provide access to things that we know will work. So if there's evidence that something's working for somebody who will die without that therapy, don't take that away from them because of some sort of abstraction of biomedical research, because that's not the right thing to do. So their slogan was healthcare is right. So they're playing on kind of moral imperatives and what's the right thing to do, as opposed to this kind of weird discourse of constitutional rights that we get in the Right to Try discourse. So the Right to Try discourse suggests that you have a right to life, but you kind of don't when you actually have a terminal illness. In the case of AIDS, particularly in the late 1980s, there were some very promising therapies, and it was difficult for patients to find clinical trials to get into, and there was no obligation for the companies and provision of therapies that were saving people's lives after the end of the trial. So that's what ACT UP wanted to do. They educated themselves, they took over FDA, they took over a couple pharmaceutical companies, and they were able to affect those changes not just in the United States, but worldwide. So if you look at the Declaration of Helsinki right now, which is kind of the dominant bioethical document for the planet Earth, that has specific measures in it, but you can see the language in the FDA Action Handbook, and that language wasn't really present in the Declaration of Helsinki until after these events.
Thank you. And what so for rhetoricians of health and medicine, and as citizens and patients who will encounter we need to, this is a matter of life and death. I mean, this is serious stuff. So how can we, what are some major takeaways for us in terms of scholarship, and what should we be doing to assist with this issue? issue?
So I guess the sort of rhetorical affordance that I started off with was Nathan Stormer's notion of articulation. And he's thinking about the relationship between words and things as performative. So there's not kind of a necessary separation there. And I was like, that's really quite fascinating. So if we think about these discourses as articulating words and things, so act up discourse, you've got patients, you have the bodies of the patients, you're kind of keeping that in mind. So there's a material discourse of health and there's a moral discourse of what's right to do. In the right to try discourse, it's all this kind of weird nebulous language. So it's this kind of odd discourse of constitutional rights and abstractions. And it just operates quite propagandistically. So for me, it's, as a rhetorician, you can look through this and say, okay, well, there's something going on in this particular discourse that defies our kind of current rhetorical models. So what motivates that? And then how might one come up with something to counter or oppose that in sort of social discourses? So are there ways to discuss with political leaders or pharmaceutical companies other things that can be done? So actually one of my friends from a professional society is setting up a meeting where he's bringing together various thinkers on this topic, and he's trying to affect change from, he's a bioethicist, so from a bioethical perspective. So I don't know that whether or not he will ultimately have anybody in rhetoric at that meeting, but that would be a good space for a rhetorician to try to tease out some of the things that are going on in the miscommunications between the various stakeholders.
Okay, great. Yeah, that seems like a really important start. And that would sort of leads to my other question about, so for us as scholars and readers in rhetoric of health and medicine, and I was going to ask about external audiences or kind of other stakeholders and practitioners and what they should be thinking about or doing at this point. And so it sounds like we start with meetings of thinkers and stakeholders in the various fields. Are there any other major things that you would like to see happen in this context?
So I guess to start out with sort of that context, I was invited to speak at the International Publication Planning Association a couple of weeks ago, and so my colleague there spoke about right to try at some length, and he's published in the Drug Information Association Journal, so that's a pharmaceutical company largely type of publication, and he's considering this in terms of bioethics. I spoke a little bit about right to try in the context of developing patient materials based on like FDA types of documentations or clinical study reports, or what we call the patient voice. So maybe patient reported outcomes or materials that are written by and for patients with particular diseases. That right to try is important to keep in mind in all of these activities because it's creating this discourse that can really undermine a lot of different activities that go on in various professions where people are trying to actively help patients and get them the correct therapies for what will in fact treat the illnesses that they have, or if they're in fact terminally ill and in need of palliative care or hospice, that they have access to that. So some right to try laws, not all of them, but some of them specifically exclude people taking advantage of right to try from getting palliative care or getting hospice care. Okay. So that's kind of bad. In terms of how we could move forward, I guess my thought is that we want to make sure that people have heard about this. So, for example, I get to participate in one of our electives at the medical school. We're doing narrative medicine this year. Last year we did a medical humanities elective. So that's a potential audience. I'm teaching undergraduate classes, so that's a potential audience. I'm going to rhetoric society, so that's another potential audience. So just continuing to think through these problems and consider the ways that continuing attention in multiple spheres can assist. For me, is what I feel like I can do as a rhetorician.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. And so it sounds like we should be talking to stakeholders and practitioners and teaching in our courses about these very important issues. For you, what's next in this line of inquiry? Do you have any future research direction with this particular topic to look forward to at this time? Or
let's see. So I've got this paper coming out in Rhetoric of Health and Medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Last year I had published a paper in the International Journal of Clinical Practice on this topic as well. So it was kind of a more physician-focused piece. And I'm currently working on a volume on bodies and embodiment, which is a comparative literature project that I've been doing. We've got a group of, actually it's so exciting, we've got a group of scholars worldwide, and people are kind of doing different projects on the body and embodiment. Right. So it's like, that's like a place where we could mention this. It'll probably be a brief mention in the introduction of that particular volume. But I'm working on an essay for a volume in, I think, women's health and health advocacy with a colleague. So, again, for me, it's like if you can kind of pop that mention into as many different places as possible, you're allowing people to have an opportunity to pick that up or to have at least heard of it so that they can maybe take their own actions as appropriate.
Okay, great. Thank you so
much.
much.
There's potentially a monograph in any project once you get something substantive, so that could be another direction.
Yeah, there's a lot of places to connect on this, again, very important matter of life and death topic. So, well, I think that concludes my questions for Lisa. And if you would like to read more, her article, The Dangers of Magical Thinking, Situating Right to Try Loss, Patients' Rights, and the Language of Advocacy, will be published in our inaugural issue of the Rhetoric of Health and Medicine, coming out soon. So thank you again, Lisa, for talking with me today and giving a preview of your article, and I'm sure we'll get lots of good feedback from RHM readers for you here in the near future.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you and also putting the article together.
Of course. Thank you.